We moved into the neighborhood in late spring, just before the first warm breeze could blow the pollen from the flowering oaks across our newly purchased front porch. It was supposed to be a fresh start. My daughter Emily had just turned 5. She was small for her age, soft-spoken, with these big brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, especially things most adults didn't even notice. Her autism diagnosis hadn't made parenting easier, but it had made our bond stronger. I worked as a county sheriff, but I always said being her dad was the badge I wore with more pride. The house was tucked into a picturesque cul-de-sac inside a gated HOA-run community called Willow Creek Lakeside. It had the kind of curated lawns and symmetrical mailboxes that practically screamed, "We are better than you." I ignored that. I wasn't looking for status. I was looking for safety, stability, and proximity to good therapy centers. Emily had sensory issues, but she loved water, not to swim in it, just to watch it ripple and dance in sunlight, so I thought the little man-made lake behind our home would be perfect. I was wrong. That's where we met her. The other homeowners called her Karen, not to her face of course. Her actual name was something like Patricia Ann, but Karen fit her like a badge of dishonor. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, technically just one of the board members, but she ran the place like it was her own personal fiefdom. Mid-50s, bleach blonde, power-walked in yoga pants every morning like she was training for suburban war. She introduced herself the day we moved in, or rather she inspected us. She clocked the moving truck, my uniform patch visible under my flannel shirt, and narrowed her eyes like I'd brought contraband. "We have guidelines about curb appearances," she said before I even told her my name. "This is a family neighborhood, very peaceful." I told her we were a family and we were peaceful too. That didn't satisfy her. Her gaze slid past me to Emily, who was rocking gently on the porch steps, watching the wind spin a pinwheel someone had left behind. Karen frowned. "Is she all right?" she asked, lips tightening like she was sucking a lemon. I told her Emily was autistic. She offered one of those fake smiles that made it clear she didn't want to understand. "Well," she said, "we all have to adjust, don't we?" It started small. Within a week of moving in, we got our first HOA citation, chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Emily had drawn a smiling cat, 3 rainbows, and what I think was supposed to be a spaceship. I thought it was beautiful. Karen thought it was graffiti. The notice said we had 48 hours to power wash it off or face fines. I did, but not before taking a picture and sending a polite email asking if this was really the kind of community we were building. I didn't get a reply. The second citation came after I installed a small therapy swing in our backyard. Emily used it to regulate, a sensory tool her OT recommended. It was discreet, behind the fence, and didn't violate any rules. Karen said it ruined the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood and posed a structural risk. I offered to send her the installation specs. She declined. More letters followed. Complaints about unusual noises, which I could only assume meant Emily humming to herself. Then a bizarre accusation that Emily had thrown rocks at ducks by the lake. She hadn't. She loved the ducks. She named them. There was Marbles, Flappy, and one she insisted was called Goose Goose. I confronted Karen after that one. I was off duty in jeans and a sweatshirt but still a cop, and a father. I kept it calm. I told her that singling out a child with special needs wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally precarious. She scoffed. "Don't try to intimidate me with your badge," she said. "Your job doesn't put you above the HOA rules. Maybe your daughter just doesn't belong here." That was the moment the real war began. Emily didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that sometimes her favorite swing was taken down, or that her sidewalk art disappeared. She noticed the way Karen looked at her, a coldness she couldn't name but clearly felt. She asked me, "Daddy, is the lady mad at me because I'm me?" That question gutted me. I told her no, that sometimes people don't understand what makes others special, and when they're afraid, they act mean. She nodded like she understood, but that night she asked if she could stop going to the duck pond. I asked her why. She just said, "Karen watches there." That chilled me. I didn't know what she meant exactly. I'd seen Karen at the lake before, always on her walks, always slowing down when she saw us. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was letting paranoia build up. After all, HOA nonsense was annoying, not dangerous, right? One evening, I caught Karen standing at the edge of the little footbridge that crossed a narrow stream leading from the lake. Emily had run ahead to look at dragonflies. Karen was just standing there, hands behind her back like she was inspecting the water. When she saw me approach, she stiffened and turned around quickly. "Nice evening," she said. I looked past her, scanned for Emily. She was a few feet down the bank, crouched beside a mossy stone, humming. I didn't smile. "We're keeping an eye out for snakes," I said, gently coded language that meant stay away from my kid. She raised an eyebrow. "Maybe you should keep a closer eye," she said. "Accidents can happen." That stuck with me, the casual cruelty of it. The quiet threat. I started taking notes. Documenting everything. Dates, times, copies of emails, video from our doorbell cam, even testimonies from other neighbors who said Karen had a history of targeting outsiders. My gut was screaming at me, but I had no evidence that crossed into criminal behavior. Not yet. But I tightened my vigilance. Every walk to the pond became a mission. Every smile from Karen a loaded weapon. And Emily? She kept shrinking. Her joyful moments became fewer. She stopped drawing. She started stimming more, especially after we ran into Karen. My daughter, who once giggled at shadows and danced in puddles, now flinched at the sight of our neighbor's Lexus. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know how bad it would be. Then one Thursday morning, something new appeared in our mailbox. Unsigned, printed on HOA letterhead, but with no record in their system. It said, "Residents who can't adapt should consider relocation for the harmony of the community." No name. No signature. I took it to the board. The other members shrugged. One guy whispered, "Karen handles most of the communication." Of course she did. I could have escalated it then. But I wanted proof. Ironclad, undeniable. I didn't want her fined. I wanted her stopped. For good. Emily's birthday was coming up. She didn't want a party. Just a walk by the lake, a balloon and cupcakes. I planned to take her Saturday morning. When Friday rolled around, Karen posted an announcement on the community board. "Lakeside Cleanup and Kids Activity Day, families welcome. Mandatory for residents." It wasn't mandatory. That was a lie. But I figured showing up might be a good chance to observe, to document. Maybe even catch Karen in a violation of her own. I told Emily we'd go together. She looked unsure but nodded. "Okay. But stay close, okay, Daddy?" "Always," I told her. "Always." We didn't know what would happen that day. We didn't know what Karen was planning. But something had shifted in her eyes the last time I saw her. The way she stared at Emily, not like a child, not like a neighbor, but like an inconvenience that needed to be removed. And though I didn't have the full picture yet, my instincts were screaming. This was no longer about HOA fines or backyard swings. This was something far more sinister. And I was going to find out. Saturday morning arrived under a sky so blue it could have been painted. The sort of morning meant for quiet cups of coffee and slow walks with your child. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not visibly but inside, an itch crawling under my skin. Years of training and active duty as a sheriff had sharpened something instinctual in me. I could feel when something was wrong, like the electricity in the air before a lightning storm. The HOA's Lakeside Cleanup and Kids Activity Day was one of those neighborhood events designed to look wholesome, but it had Karen's fingerprints all over it. Bright flyers, strict attendance suggestions, and a recommended donation, written in bold, $20 per family. Attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but everyone knew noncompliance would be met with passive-aggressive letters and fines for unrelated infractions shortly after. Karen used these events to assert control. But this time I felt something darker. I dressed casually, jeans, boots, a sheriff's department t-shirt, but underneath my jacket I carried both my badge and my sidearm, holstered but ready. I told myself it was precautionary, even overkill. But something deep inside said, "You'll need it." Emily wore her favorite yellow jumper with butterflies stitched on the sleeves. She clutched her plush octopus, Mr. Wobbly, her constant companion, her emotional anchor. She looked up at me with wide eyes as we left the house. "Do I have to talk to her?" she asked softly. I knelt beside her. "No, sweetheart. Not if you don't want to. You stick with me, okay?" She nodded, more serious than usual. "Okay, Daddy." We arrived at the lake park around 10:10. People were scattered across the grass and walkways with garbage bags and picker tools. Kids ran around near the water's edge. Adults sipped coffee and mingled. It would have looked perfectly pleasant to an outsider. Karen stood dead center at the sign-in table like a movie villain. Oversized sunglasses, a pink reflective vest that said, "Event Lead," in cheap black Sharpie, and a clipboard like it was a scepter. She was talking to someone but looked up the moment we approached. No smile. No wave. Just a cold, assessing stare. She didn't say a word. That was the first red flag. Karen was never silent. Her silence meant calculation. I kept my eyes on her but didn't react. Emily stayed close, slightly behind my leg, watching the ducks in the water. She reached out a hand. "There's Goose Goose," she whispered. "And Flappy." We joined a few other families and picked up litter around the trail. Emily did her part, carefully placing wrappers and bits of paper in her little bag. She beamed each time I praised her. "That's amazing, Em. You're doing great." For a brief moment she looked truly happy. Then around 10:38 a.m., I looked down to silence my phone. 5 seconds. That's all it took. When I looked up, Emily was gone. I didn't panic, not immediately. She sometimes drifted toward interesting bugs or flowers. I scanned the area. No yellow jumper, no Mr. Wobbly. My heart started pounding harder. "Emily?" I called. Louder, "Emily." Heads turned. People paused. I moved faster, weaving between groups, eyes scanning, every step tightening the grip on my lungs. A young teen pointed toward the wooden footbridge across the lake. "She was over there with that woman," he said, uncertain. I ran. The footbridge crossed a shallow stream that fed into the lake, maybe a 6-foot drop to the rocky water below. Kids often played around it, but something felt off. When I reached it, I froze. Karen was there, alone, standing at the middle of the bridge, hands folded in front of her like a statue, gazing down into the water. "Where is she?" I barked. Karen turned slowly, almost too slowly. "She ran off," she said calmly. "I told her not to go near the edge. But, certain children." My vision narrowed. I pushed past her and looked down. And I saw her. Emily's yellow jumper, soaked and tangled in reeds. Face down in the water. Mr. Wobbly floating beside her. Time shattered. I leapt over the bridge rail without thinking, landed hard in the rocks, splashed through the stream and scooped her up. Her body was limp, too limp, her lips tinged blue. I turned her over, heart thudding in my ears. Then she gasped. Weak, sputtering, coughing, but alive. "Call an ambulance." I screamed up at the bridge. Karen hadn't moved. She just stood there, her hands folded, staring down at me with a face that no longer pretended, no charm, no fake civility. Just flat eyes. And then, the corner of her mouth twitched. A smirk. That was when I knew. She hadn't lost track of my daughter. She had thrown her in. The EMTs arrived quickly. Emily was stabilized, rushed to the hospital, and monitored overnight. Diagnosed with a mild concussion, cuts, and shock. The water had slowed her fall, but had I arrived seconds later, she would have drowned. I stayed beside her every second. I held her hand through the IVs, the EEGs, the whispering nurses. She barely spoke, but she was alive. Then the other part of me took over, the lawman. I contacted my lieutenant. Told him exactly what happened. He ordered an independent investigator to avoid bias, but he didn't stop me from pursuing my own leads. I canvassed neighbors. Found 2 teenage girls who'd seen Emily with Karen just before the fall. One said, Karen had her by the wrist. Emily looked scared. Then she screamed and I didn't see her anymore. They hadn't spoken up earlier, afraid, confused. I pulled every scrap of community camera footage, security systems, Ring doorbells, HOA cams. The break came from a camera across the lake. It captured a wide-angle view of the bridge. It wasn't high-res, but you could clearly see Karen leading Emily onto the bridge. Emily stopping. Karen bending forward. Emily retreating. Then Karen lunging. And Emily disappeared. I forwarded the clip to the investigator. He watched, paused at the critical second, then turned to me. Jesus. That's attempted murder. Karen was arrested that evening at her home. Her smug facade was intact until the cuffs came out. You can't be serious, she said. That child is unstable. She ran from me. But her story unraveled fast. A warrant search of her home turned up printed copies of the false HOA notices, threatening drafts addressed to my household, and a handwritten list labeled, Problem Properties, Plan of Action. My name, my address, and Emily's name, circled in red. Evidence mounted. The forged signatures, the complaint letters, the surveillance, the witness testimonies. She wasn't just cruel, she was methodical. The charges were severe. Attempted murder. Aggravated child endangerment. Falsification of community documentation. Harassment. Obstruction of justice. The community was stunned. Those who once looked the other way now flooded social media and board meetings with apologies, memories, outrage. One woman cried on my doorstep. She fined me for having Halloween decorations up too long, she said. But I never imagined she was capable of this. The entire HOA board resigned in the days following. A new interim board issued a formal apology to my family and pledged to overhaul all HOA policies related to personal disputes, neurodiversity, and safety. Emily began speaking again after 2 days. She didn't want to talk about the bridge. She didn't even want to look out the window. But one evening in the hospital, she reached over and touched my badge. "You're my hero, Daddy," she said softly. That broke me. I cried for the first time in years. Not as a sheriff, not as a man, but as a father who had almost lost everything. When Emily was finally cleared to return home, she asked if we could visit the ducks. "Only if we hold hands the whole time," she added. We walked slowly past the bridge to the shoreline. Goose honked at us. Flappy flapped wildly in the water. Emily laughed, a real laugh, and whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." I crouched down beside her and kissed the top of her head. "You never need to be scared again. Not while I'm here." And I meant it. The days following Karen's arrest were a whirlwind, quiet on the surface but underneath, a raging tide. Emily was safe at home, recovering with Mr. Wobbly clutched tightly in her arms, but the bruises on her skin were nothing compared to the fear still in her eyes. She had trouble sleeping. Certain words, bridge, Karen, water, made her flinch. Her mother and I took shifts at her bedside, rotating comfort and support. As a father, I felt every breath of hers like a tiny battle one. As a sheriff, I burned with resolve. Karen would not walk away from this. Not this time. The investigation unfolded fast. We had momentum. Footage, eyewitnesses, forged documents, even motive. Karen's history with the HOA wasn't just one of microaggressions or bureaucratic bullying, it was obsessive. Investigators found files and notes on several neighbors, including 3 families with neurodivergent children. One was fined for child-induced noise pollution, after their autistic son had a meltdown on their front lawn. Karen kept spreadsheets, columns labeled pattern, compliance level, and removal strategy. She didn't want a neighborhood. She wanted a fiefdom. And she had planned to control it by eliminating what she called outliers. The DA knew they had something explosive. Attempted murder charges rarely came with such clean-cut evidence. The bridge footage, while distant, showed too much for a defense attorney to ignore. But Karen hired one of the best in the state, Donovan Keller, a smug courtroom tactician known for flipping narratives and playing to jury sympathy. The court date was set 6 weeks after the incident. Long enough for preparation. Short enough that the media hadn't yet turned it into a circus. My department put me on leave during the trial, for conflict of interest concerns. I agreed. I needed to be with Emily, and I needed to focus on seeing justice through without distraction. But inside, I wanted the badge back. I wanted to be the one closing the cell door on Karen. During that time, the community around us transformed. Neighbors who used to glance away began checking in. Kids sent Emily handmade cards. One family, whose autistic son had been terrified of Karen for years, brought cookies and quietly said, "You stopped her before it got worse." For the first time in years, fences didn't matter, politics didn't matter. Fear turned into something useful, accountability. Court began on a cold Monday morning. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Emily stayed home, her mother didn't want her near the courthouse. I walked in wearing my off-duty jacket and sat behind the prosecution's bench. Karen sat across from us in a navy blue dress, hair tied back in a tight bun, eyes scanning everyone with that familiar arrogance. She didn't look guilty. She looked offended to even be there. Her lawyer's opening argument was bold, a tragic misunderstanding, a well-meaning woman, an unfortunate accident. They painted Emily as wandering, emotionally unstable, and Karen as a kind but overmatched community leader who simply couldn't react fast enough. When they called Karen to testify, she cried. Talked about her volunteer hours. About being misunderstood. She claimed she reached for Emily to help her, not push her. Then came the footage. The prosecutor played the lake cam recording. No sound but crystal clear timing. Karen walking Emily to the bridge. Emily backing up. Karen lunging. The jury watched in silence. Next came the document evidence. Her fake HOA letters, complaint lists, and the spreadsheet. They projected it on the courtroom screen, and I'll never forget the moment when problem property, sheriff and child, appeared in large black letters. The jury shifted. Even her own lawyer's face twitched. But the moment that truly shattered her defense came from a surprise witness, Mrs. Patina, an elderly neighbor Karen had long pushed around. No one thought she'd testify. But she stepped up, her voice trembling but firm. She told me once that certain people don't belong here. And when I asked what people, she said, "Noisy ones. Broken ones. The kind that make others uncomfortable." She looked toward the jury. She meant that little girl. Karen's mask cracked. Her foot tapped. Her lawyer asked for a recess. Denied. In the end, it didn't take long. The jury found her guilty on all counts: attempted murder, child endangerment, harassment, falsifying official documents, obstruction of justice. The judge did not hold back. In this courtroom, he said during sentencing, we deal with many forms of evil, some violent, some subtle. What makes this case disturbing is that it was both. A child was nearly killed, and the defendant orchestrated it under the disguise of community order. He handed down a sentence of 22 years without parole. When the gavel hit, Karen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at me as they cuffed her. A hollow stare. No more superiority. No more smirk. Just someone who had finally lost their last game. I stood as she was taken away. My badge was clipped inside my jacket pocket. I touched it once. Then I walked out. The next few months were about healing. Emily slowly returned to normal. We got her into trauma therapy specialized for neurodiverse children. She was hesitant at first, but the therapist had puppets, and eventually she opened up. She never said the word bridge, but she would whisper, "The lady tried to hurt me." One evening she asked, "Is she gone forever?" I knelt beside her and said, "She'll never hurt you again." The new HOA board met with me in person, apologized, and asked me to help revise their bylaws. Together we created new protective measures for vulnerable families, limits on HOA executive power, and mandatory oversight on fines and community policies. Karen's reign of terror was not going to return, not here, not anywhere. A year later, Emily stood on that same bridge again. This time with me, her mother, and a handful of friends. She tossed paper boats into the stream, each one with a word written on it: strong, brave, safe, loved. She watched them drift away and smiled. The past hadn't disappeared, but we had reclaimed it, rewritten it. She turned to me and said, "Let's go home, Daddy." I picked her up, held her close, and we walked into a future that no longer had room for fear.